Hi there. My name is Joe Brummer. I'm the author of the book Building a Trauma-Informed Restorative School. Welcome to the 2021 Relational Schools Conference. This presentation is going to be about really my new book, How to Build a Trauma-Informed Restorative School. Currently, many of our schools are moving to the practices and principles of restorative justice. But we really want those principles and practices to also be trauma-informed, to really make sure that every student, even if they've had some traumatic experiences in their childhood and in their home life, can still come to school and have the same educational opportunities that other children have. As I begin my presentation, like many others before me in this conference, I'd like to acknowledge that the lands that I'm on belong rightfully to the tribes of the Hamanasset, the Quinnipiac, and the Wappinger. It is important that we acknowledge these facts because all too often the history of Indigenous people has been erased. And by making these land acknowledgements, we can acknowledge what has happened, that these lands are stolen, that these lands were taken from people and people were pushed off of them. And by acknowledging that, we can acknowledge that history and take a responsibility that these things have happened. All too often that is forgotten. So let's talk about what trauma is and what trauma isn't. Trauma is not the events that we go through. It is actually our body's response to those events. It can have long-lasting impacts on us. And we know that because of a study called the ACEs study, which is often referred to when we talk about trauma and trauma-informed care. During the ACEs study, 17,337 people were given a questionnaire with dozens of questions. 10 of those questions asked about physical, emotional abuse and neglect, as well as household dysfunction. Of the 17,337 people in the study, 2/3 of them had at least a 1. In other words, they had experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. Of the people that said 1, 87 of them had additional adverse childhood experiences. Roughly 1 in 8 members of the general public, of those 17,337 people, 1 in 8 people basically had a score of 4 or higher. Just think about that. Think about all the people that you meet in a day and how many of them are walking around with 4 or higher of adverse childhood experiences. 90% of those people in the study who had reported that they had addiction or mental health issues also had ACEs. There was a direct correlation between the two. So what do we know about these scores? Well, for starters, just having a score of 4 or higher doubled and tripled in some cases the chances for heart disease, pulmonary disease, skeletal fractures, liver disease, sexually transmitted diseases, cancer, and chronic depression. Those are all the physical impacts of adverse childhood experiences. But the study also showed us that there were social impacts to adverse childhood experiences. So those that scored a 4 or higher were twice as likely to have serious financial problems. They were greater likelihood of being a smoker, greater likelihood of work absenteeism. For women, there was a greater chance that they would be susceptible to rape. For men and women, there was a 700% chance that they would be an alcoholic. Children, 17 times greater likelihood that they would have behavioral problems or learning problems in school. We know because for many of us, we've met those kids. With a score of 5 or higher, women had a much greater likelihood of perpetrating domestic violence. Men had a 6 times greater likelihood of perpetrating domestic violence. Men had a 46 times greater likelihood of IV drug use. And for both men and women, there was a 30 times greater likelihood of a suicide attempt. The things that we experience as children basically create for us a paradigm where our entire bodies are impacted. And trauma sort of stays in our body until we manage to integrate it into our systems. But if we don't manage to do that, it actually stays within our system doing some harm. If you add things like historical trauma that's passed down from generations to generations, then we're talking about serious impacts from small events. And when you take those events and add them on, almost like the dosage of a toxic medicine. The higher the dose and the more often it comes, the worse the impacts. And really, what it looks like is as we have generational experiences of trauma and then we have individual experiences of trauma, really it can look a little bit like this pyramid. That there are adverse childhood experiences along with our historical experiences of trauma that create social and emotional cognitive impairments. And those lead to what the health experts would have called health risk behaviors, what I just referred to as coping mechanisms, ways that people have come to cope with the experiences that they have had and the impacts that have had on our bodies. And unfortunately, some of those lead to disease and social outcomes and even early death. So, what are the impacts of trauma on children? Well, so a different thing that happens about adverse childhood experiences versus trauma happening to an adult is that it interrupts the development of a child. And so for some children, that can impact memory, learning, the development of their senses, attention and focus, even behavioral issues, health issues. These experiences have a lifelong impact on us, on our senses. It can interrupt our sense of touch. And so for some kids, even soft clothing on their skin can feel like sandpaper. It can affect our vestibular systems and how we see ourselves and our body in space and time. That's the kid that might sit on the other kids during, circle time because they can't really figure out where their body's supposed to go, and we think they're fooling around when really just some of those systems are not working for them. It can also interrupt their interoceptive systems, which is their ability to know when it's time to use the restroom, or when they've eaten too much, or when they've not eaten enough. They don't really know that they're hungry, or when they need to use the bathroom and in what way. And for some kids, those things can be even deeper, as the anxiety of going to the restroom by themselves can be terribly frightening. Each of these issues for children contribute to what we would call toxic stress. So we have different kinds of stress. We have positive stress that helps children develop. That's like the first day of school and mom has to drop you off and you cry. The adults buffer you through that and it becomes okay. That's what we consider, sort of positive, tolerable stress. Then we have stress that is sort of normal stuff that just happens in life, like, losing a parent or, growing up in poverty. That these things can be difficult, but they're not necessarily toxic stress, as long as there's a buffering adult for a child to manage and help co-regulate that stress. Toxic stress happens to children when they have adverse childhood experiences and traumatic events, and there is no buffering adult to come and help them and co-regulate with their nervous system. Oftentimes, not only is there no adult to help buffer them, sometimes the adults that are supposed to be their buffer are actually the source of that trauma. What are some possible traumatic events that could lead students to have these issues? Well, for starters, things like separation from a primary caregiver or a parent, a disruptive home life, homelessness, which doesn't always look like what we think it does. Sometimes homelessness means couch surfing or multiple families having to stay in the same place because they don't have their own place. Or even the question mark of, can kids do their homework or find a quiet place at a homeless shelter? There are things like poverty, divorce, bullying, the foster care system, where kids may be moved from place to place to place, not really having a secure base. Fetal alcohol syndrome, death in a family, even uninvolved parents. By the way, uninvolved doesn't mean bad parents. It means that they are parents who are working really hard to put food on the table, but that doesn't really mean that they always have time to read to their children or spend time with their children. And so, and this is not a full list. Trauma happens to us when our systems are overwhelmed to the point that we think that we can't cope. And that can happen from a variety of things that happen to us in our lives. But for children, that can directly interrupt the development of a growing brain. We also need to acknowledge what we call collective trauma. Collective trauma is when we take large groups of people and put them through traumatic events as a population. Examples of this would be things like COVID-19, the racial unrest that's happening around the United States, natural disasters that are happening, and wildfires that are happening here in the United States and Australia. We have large events that are happening that are impacting large groups of people, and the trauma of those events can last for generations. Currently, our COVID-19 pandemic has left all of us sort of in the same storm, but not necessarily in the same boats. Some of us have very different sets of resources to manage this pandemic and this lockdown, where other people don't have those resources. We need to be mindful of the impacts of collective trauma. Examples of collective trauma are things like COVID-19. They are also things like slavery and war and genocide, Jim Crow, the HIV/AIDS epidemic, natural disasters. These are events that are happening historically and impacting generations of people. Sometimes the legacy of those things live on in our laws, in our policies, and even in the way we approach things. We need to be sure that when we're examining trauma, that we're taking a hard look at generations of trauma and putting a stop to it. Next, let's talk about how trauma impacts a developing brain. For starters, a brain that's not really been exposed to trauma has the ability to be compassionate, present, to really engage with the world in healthy and secure ways because it feels safe. It's able to process language readily and easily. It's able to think in terms of sequential order thinking. In other words, the order of how things happen, which will be important for how children process things like punishments and rewards. It's a brain that also has a sense of time. Time and the ability to process time are unique to human beings. And it's a function that lives in our frontal cortex of our brain, something we don't have access to when we're in a state of fight or flight. When children have never been exposed to traumatic events and their brains are able to develop the way they're supposed to, they have full access to these higher order thinking skills. It means that their brain kind of works from the top down. In other words, if this was your brain, and this is your brainstem, and this is your limbic system, and then wrapped over that, this would be your frontal cortex. This is where all the higher order thinking stuff happens. When your brain's never been exposed to trauma, you think from here, down. When your brain's been exposed to trauma, you think from here, up. In other words, a brain that has been exposed to trauma, again, there's no like trauma then this. It's not that linear. But a brain that's been impacted by trauma may have some problems with frustration tolerance, the ability to sort of regulate our nervous system. It's a brain that has trouble with sequential order thinking, which means it's really hard to process consequences. The sort of like if this, then that, functioning of the world. And so very oftentimes we make a threat to a child with who's been exposed to trauma, and we say, one more time and you'll get a suspension. And they're like, oh. And it's not because they don't care. It's literally because they can't process that information in the same way other kids can. Some other things about a kid that's been exposed to trauma, the time piece is important. That, when you've been exposed to trauma, you're going to get stuck in that fight or flight place where time almost stands still. There's now, because the trauma and the threat are here now. There's no such thing as like, if after recess everybody's good, we'll do, none of that later stuff is there. And some kids who've been exposed to trauma also may have impulse control. And so not only is there not a later, there's I want that treat now and I'm just going to take it because I don't know how to stop myself. See, kids that have been exposed to trauma have, they also see typical traditional disciplinary methods of punishments and rewards to be stress. They're additional stress that their bodies and their systems do not have room to take on. So, in other words, when we offer them the threat of a punishment or a reward, what we're also offering them is a threat that becomes stress. Those things are external stressors that they just don't have the capacity in their system to take on additional stressors. So let's also talk about how fight, flight, freeze, and traumatic responses show up in our classrooms as behavior. When we're aware that kids' behavior might actually be coming from their experiences, it moves us away from thinking that they're in trouble and starts to wake us up to the fact they're in struggle. And so these behaviors tend to show up almost like they sound: fight, flight, freeze, faint, fawn. Fight behavior looks like fight until it doesn't. I mean, you can think of like balled up fists, talking back at your teacher, slamming things. This looks like fight, except also note silliness. Sometimes kids, when they feel uncomfortable, or quite frankly, sometimes adults, sometimes when we feel uncomfortable, we get a burst of serotonin that is meant to motivate us and uplift our spirits so we care about the threat, but it can also make us silly. Then there's things like flight. Flight is another one that it looks like flight. Kids not showing up to class, walking out of class, actually running out of school. I've been in a school once where a third grader just darted out the front building while people chased after him, and he wanted out of that school. It can also be things like cutting class. It can be, what I call hovering. That student that is running away from something but running to you. Another place that we see flight behavior is headphones. Kids put in their headphones or their earbuds because it does several things. One, it blocks out sensory perception stuff. And so if there's a lot of chaos and noise that's raising a kid's anxiety, this might be a way of dulling that down. And then, of course, what's the message that headphones send to other people of, get away from me? And so then there's freeze behavior. Freeze behavior also, well, let me go back one on flight too. Let's talk freeze behavior. Freeze behavior is, did you ever see those kids that kind of look like they're not in there? Their eyes are glassed over and they're sort of spaced out someplace else. These actually could be freeze behaviors. That's the head on the desk. That's the kid that's, not responding to you when you call his name, and they're kind of like, what? Even at the worst, some kids will not recognize faces because they can't get that part of their brain to work. And then there's fawn behavior. Fawn behavior is those students that sort of exaggerate and try to become friends with the threat. Fawning behavior is mostly happens in women because it's based in a chemical that women have more of, which is called oxytocin. And it's sort of like a trusting, bonding chemical in our systems. For women, it's also a stress reliever. It's related also to lactose and to lactating in pregnancy. But it also is a stress hormone. And for all of us, it can engage in a way that makes us try to befriend our enemies to stop them from hurting us. All of these behaviors can get mistaken for bad behavior, when in reality, they may be very adaptive behaviors kids have developed to actually keep them safe. They may not look like fight, flight, survival behaviors to you, but to the child that's using these behaviors, there are times where these things are very helpful to them. Hit pause. And while you've got pause, go get yourself a piece of paper. Write down on this piece of paper 4 words: punishment, consequence, accountability, and discipline. And then I'd like you to write down what these words mean and how they're different. In other words, what do you think punishment is? What is a consequence? And how is a punishment different than a consequence? How is discipline different than punishment? Really write down these words and figure out, what do they mean? How are they different? I'll give you a second to do that. This is where you hit pause and come back. So what'd you come up with? Punishment, discipline, consequences, accountability. What do these words even mean? Well, for me, and I know this is an extreme viewpoint that I might hold on my own, but I believe that punishment is a form of violence. The entire goal of punishment is to inflict suffering on another human being when you had other choices to teach them. I just see no use in punishment, and I can't believe that peace and punishment can coexist on our planet. And so I don't really have much use for punishment. I would really like us to turn to more protective measures of force rather than punitive measures of force. That would be the nonviolent approach to this work. But let's look at the other words. Consequences. Consequences are simply the result of your actions, for better or for worse. You can't make those up. If you had to make it up, it's just punishment. Accountability? Accountability seems to be equated with punishment, which is interesting because I can serve out my punishment and never take ownership of my actions. So why do we equate punishment and accountability? That if you served out the punishment, suddenly you're accountable. That's not accountability. Carolyn Boyce Watson and Kay Prentice, in their book Circle Forward, talk about accountability having 5 dimensions. One, you gotta own your actions and that they caused harm. You need to know who you harmed and in what ways. Repair that harm. 3, 4, you got to repay your community for bringing harm. And 5, you've got to assure this that this isn't going to happen again. That feels accountability to me. And funny enough, none of that talks about anybody suffering. In fact, it talks about a move toward healing, not suffering. The last one on that list is discipline, that I'd like to talk about. Discipline, I know your dictionary tells you that it's a verb. I don't believe you can do it. It's not a verb. You don't do discipline. And when people say, I'm going to discipline someone, they really mean punish. Discipline is like something inside us that we cultivate and nurture. We don't do it. And so when somebody uses that as code in your building, like, that kid needs some discipline, they really just mean punishment. What we really mean when we talk about discipline is nurturing, doing the right thing when no one's looking. That sounds like discipline to me. What does the research actually say about punishments? So I know that I personally consider punishment to be violence because we're inflicting suffering on other people. Well, what does the research say? Well, the research backs up what I think. It basically says that this is really harmful for kids. First off, it's focused on the wrong things. It's focused on the past, not the future. So it's not what kids will learn. It's what's already happened and probably isn't going to change. It teaches kids to lie. I could have told you that. But what kid's going to tell you the truth when they know what you'll do to them? It rarely results in changes. At best, it gets you compliance. Compliance is not the same. We heard in Sky Bowen's presentation where she talks about a school that's built on community versus a school that's built on control. Punishment leads to a school that's based on control, not engagement, not relationship, and certainly not community. It reinforces that failure identity because those kids that get in trouble all the time know that they are those kids. It's sort of this idea that I'm a kid that does bad things, so I get punished. And because I get punished, I think that I'm a kid that does bad things, so I do bad things. A self-fulfilling prophecy. And then I get punished for doing bad things. This cycle never really ends for many kids. It also teaches what you don't want instead of what you do want. At the end of the day, punishment sends a message to children that when they're struggling with an unsolved problem, that we will add to that stress, not support them. Punishment at the end of the day also models bullying. I know that's a surprise for many people, but there's not much of a real difference between give me your lunch money and one more time and you get a detention. It's a threat. Why are we threatening our children? One of the biggest questions that I get during my trainings from educators about, children who've been exposed to trauma is the magical question: how will we know which kids in the class have been exposed to trauma and which ones haven't? And that's actually a scary question. Prior to COVID, I would have said that you just don't know which kids have been exposed to trauma and which ones haven't. Post COVID, the answer is all of your students, all of your staff have been exposed to a traumatic event, and that is called a pandemic, collective trauma. And so, what do we do with that? And just so we borrow a concept from infectious disease, bloodborne pathogens, which, if you're a teacher in many states, you're required to take a class on bloodborne pathogens. And the idea is, which is funny to talk about during a pandemic, that we don't know who has an infectious disease, and so we wear gloves, we wash our hands, we wear a gown and a mask. We take precautions because we don't know. Let's borrow that concept and apply that concept to school. We don't know which kids have been exposed to trauma and which ones haven't. We don't know what's going on in their home life, and very much worse, we don't know when. So maybe on Friday, little Billy had never been exposed to trauma, but today's Monday, and now he has. I know that's a scary thought. Well, we have to think this way to protect children and students. We also need to think that way about our staff, because the same could be true of them. So let's talk about what some universal precautions might be. And so first off, in a school building, no yelling. We need calm, reassuring voices all the time. When kids are going to get into a tornado, don't jump in with them. 2, easily digestible instructions. Kids that have been exposed to trauma may have issues around memory and learning, so making instructions really easily digestible, and maybe even putting a pause in between multiple directions so kids have a chance to catch up. Avoid anything public shaming and blaming. No more clip charts. No more yelling at kids in the hallway. We want to scale that back. We want to, I know this sounds like a crazy one, don't pick little kids up from behind, although I'm going to go into considerations for early childhood in a second, but try not to pick younger kids up from behind. It can be really frightening to just suddenly be flying in the air. No tickling. I can't believe it's 2020 and I'm still saying that. Tickling is not really cool for kids. There's lots of research on it. Go read it. Ask before hugging and touching. I really think it's important that we teach kids consent, but this is also true for adults. Some people don't find hugs and touching comforting like you think they would. And so for some people, touching them might be really painful. And so just avoid touching people without asking them permission. If you're going to touch somebody, just ask, can I give you a hug? Can I shake your hand? Connect and calm the nervous system before you want to address any behavior. And so in Bruce Perry's work, this is the 3 R's that we want to regulate, relationship, then reason. And so we want to make sure that the nervous system is regulated, that they're reassured of the relationship we have before we do any kind of reasoning work about their behavior. And then last on this list, which is part of my love of nonviolent communication, we want to make sure that we're using non-judgmental language. When kids make mistakes, they don't really need your condemnation. What they need is your support in cleaning up the mess that they've made. They know they made mistakes. And sometimes when we walk them through that stuff, they're trying to hide how much shame and embarrassment they might feel. And so really using that non-judgmental language of like, look, let me help you clean this up. That was really a mess. That was unacceptable behavior, but let me help you clean up the mess that made. Also, a quick note for our early childhood educators. A couple considerations about being trauma informed and taking some standard precautions for our early childhood folks. One, I want you to think about nap time. Just think about that for a second. You're turning off the lights. It's almost kind of the equivalent of bedtime. For a lot of children, that's when bad things happen. So that could be a scary time for them. Even just having the lights go out can be scary. Handoff and pick up are important. Who are you handing that child off to? Sometimes when parents drop their kids off, Who is the person that will meet that child every morning? For a lot of our younger people, our younger students, there's still stranger danger, so that can be a really frightening experience for them. I want you to think about food and snack time. Earlier, we talked about how this interrupts their senses, and this is one of those places that if food has become or food has been used as a punitive tool against a child, either dinner being withheld or they don't have access to food. They may be food hoarders or food gorgers for our younger students, where they're literally eating to the point that they make themselves sick because their bodies just don't know to tell them that they're full. We want to look at how kids are playing and how that may reflect things that are going on at home, and be really careful about routines and schedules. For children who've been exposed to trauma, those routines and schedules become important because they make life predictable, and predictable means safe. So just think about some of those considerations for our younger students. What does that make the role of restorative justice in a trauma-informed relational school? And the answer is restorative justice has been almost missold to schools, at least here in the United States. And I also believe in some other places. It's been sold to people as this alternative discipline system, when it's just not. It's a holistic system built in relationships. Yes, there is an alternative discipline part of it, but that's only a part. If you were to think of restorative justice as a car, I know that's a weird thought, just go with it. If you were to think of this as a car, the front end of this car is all about building relationships, building a community where everyone is welcome. Regardless what they look like, who they love, how old they are, we're building a community where everyone is welcome at the table, where we really understand our students. Dorothy Vandering and Kathy Evans describe this in their book as a relational ecology. What is the health of the relational ecology of the building? Do we have healthy and strong relationships? And on the other side of that is the back of the car. The back of the car is what happens when harm comes. Do we see that as rule breaking and discipline, or do we see that as harm that requires some cleanup, some healing? And rather than judging students for their mistakes, we're there to support them in cleaning them up and helping to process and make sense of those events. Sometimes a harm circle isn't as much about repairing harm as it is making sense of the events that have happened. In order to get someplace and to have a fully relational school, you need the whole car. I'd love to see you try to drive a car with like half a car. We need the whole car. We need all four wheels if we're going to get somewhere, to have a completely relational school. Currently, I'm using an integrated approach to implementing this work. That way that I can implement the ideas of equity and racial justice, restorative justice principles, mindfulness, trauma-informed principles, along with nonviolent communication and the work of Marshall Rosenberg, along with the work of Ross Greene around collaborative and proactive solutions, which are a powerful way of helping to collaboratively work with students who have challenging behavior. All of this has to be done in an integrated way and a planned way. We need a top-down, bottom-up approach to the work. From the top-down level, we need leadership on board to help us with policy changes, procedure changes, even the funding. We need to invest time, and leadership needs to be on board with that. We also need a bottom-up approach where we harness the wisdom of the community, both teachers, parents, and the voice of students. Students' voice can be brought into this work as young as 3rd and 4th grade, and I'm sure that there are people that can find ways to bring even younger students into this work to allow their voices to be heard. When I come into a school, one of the approaches that I've been taking is to form implementation teams. And if there are multiple schools, I'll bring those implementation teams from each school into a cohort of up to 5 schools at a time. I ask each individual school to create a 3-year plan of how they will roll out these ideas of nonviolent communication, mindfulness, equity, restorative justice, and trauma informed. Each of this is going to take time, and each of it's going to take time to learn the skills and practices, along with unlearning a lot of other skills and practices that have not worked for us. In that plan, we need to see how the code of conduct will be addressed to make sure that it is, one, racially just, and two, that it's understanding of students who are coming to school who have been impacted by trauma. We need to make sure that we have community partners in place, things like food banks, mental health clinicians. We need to make sure that every student has access to the resources that they need to be the best that they can be. This is going to require a plan that addresses procedural changes, like our paperwork, our referral forms, and how we even do our schedule. It may be time to look at the schedule to find out if there's time to circle kids up on a regular basis to build community. We may need physical changes to our building to make sure that it's safe and trauma informed. That means decluttering classrooms, really taking a second look at the posters we have on the wall and how much color and sensory input children have to process. And looking at building safety. We may even look at how we allow some students to have lunch in crowded areas and what rules that we have in place for the physical building. We might also need to think about a plan for professional development. I'm not a big fan of just coming in and training people and praying it works. I really think we need an organized plan of when we will train people in what. For my approach to this, there are a variety of restorative practices that I bring into schools, and maybe we don't roll every single practice out in the first year. Maybe we do that in year 2, year 3. This way we can harness the power of professional development time to coordinate with the things that we want to roll out in the timing that we want to roll them out. As I bring this presentation to a close, I just have a couple of quick thoughts. And one of those is just the acknowledgement of how much this can only scratch the surface of the work. And I really want you to have more in-depth idea of how trauma and being trauma-informed is so important to restorative justice. Restorative justice principles are in and of themselves not completely trauma-informed. We need that knowledge of how trauma impacts the brain to guide our actions, to make sure that when we're circling kids up, that we're doing that with a mindset on were their behaviors adaptive from their traumas and from their experiences. I say all this for the reasoning that I am a trauma survivor. I am twice the survivor of 2 violent crimes. I am also the survivor of child abuse and bullying in school. As an LGBTQ student, I was bullied pretty relentlessly. And so I really also want to ask you, as you do this work, to keep an eye out for your LGBTQ students. Sometimes they go under the radar, and we need to keep an eye out to keep them safe. And then finally, my last request of this is to, if you can, read my book. It goes a lot more in depth than I could in this presentation. And it wouldn't exist without a note and a thank you to Margaret Thorsborn for her amazing ability to help me edit and make this book, readable for 5 countries, which was a little new for me. So a thank you to her and to the team at Jessica Kingsley Publishers who helped me publish the book. And then to the amazing Judy Atkinson, who wrote the book Trauma Trails, Recreating Songlines, which talks about healing trauma through Indigenous ways in Australia. And I've learned so much and learned to question so much about our mental health systems here in the West and to really look at Indigenous ways of thinking about trauma. And so a special thank you to Judy. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you get to enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks for listening.